Welcome to the Explainer. Today we're digging into the 90-mile tripwire and looking at Cuba's role on the geopolitical chessboard. We're exploring a seriously fascinating high-stakes premise here. How could a relatively tiny island nation theoretically trigger a massive global conflict? History tells us that the sparks that ignite the absolute biggest fires, well, they usually come from the smallest places. So let's jump right in and look at exactly why Cuba remains such a massive potential flashpoint.
Okay, think about the dynamic between the United States and Taiwan for a second. The US provides some very extensive, concrete backing to Taiwan. We're talking billions in direct military sales, things like F-16 fighter jets and heavy defensive missile systems. Now, flip the geographic script. You'll see a complete parallel with China, and especially with Russia, providing really critical support right back to Cuba. This mirroring effect is just absolutely crucial to understand. Just as America supports a strategic partner that sits right near a rival superpower, Russia and China are projecting their own influence straight into the Caribbean. And look, we're not taking sides here. We're literally just observing the chessboard. Superpowers constantly project power in regions that are incredibly sensitive to their rivals. All right, so let's move into our first major focus, strategic military risks. Support and diplomacy are one thing. But when global alliances collide with physical geography, the stakes go way, way up. The geopolitical reality of this entire region really just boils down to a single number, 90. Cuba is located only about 90 miles south of Florida. To put that into perspective, that's roughly an hour-and-a-half drive on the highway, assuming you could build a bridge across the ocean. It places the island nation exceptionally close to the U.S. mainland. And in the world of international relations and military strategy, 90 miles is practically point-blank range. It turns literally every political move on the island into a super high-stakes maneuver. Now, as of right now, no foreign country has an established military base in Cuba. That's the current, albeit fragile, status quo. But when you combine that reality with that extreme proximity to the U.S. mainland we just talked about, you hit a stark, non-negotiable red line. The United States has an absolute intolerance for enemy bases on the island. The source analysis makes it crystal clear. If any adversarial nation were to cross that threshold and set up a base there, the U.S. simply would not tolerate it. Period. End of story. It is a massive line drawn in the sand, and crossing it could theoretically trigger an immediate, massive global conflict.
While there aren't any foreign military bases right now, the relationships that could eventually pave the way for them? Yeah, those already exist. Which brings us to our second key focus, economic ties to Russia. Because let's be real, geopolitics almost always runs on a foundation of economics.
Looking at the actual pillars of Russian support, we see two massive lifelines, economic and military. This isn't just, vague diplomatic handshakes and photo ops. On the economic front, Russia has provided incredibly crucial oil shipments to literally keep the Cuban power grid running, and they've repeatedly restructured billions in old Soviet-era debt. Then, on the military front, the relationship goes even deeper through shared intelligence cooperation and very highly visible visits from Russian naval vessels and even nuclear-powered submarines right into Havana's port. This dual-layered support totally alters the region's strategic landscape. It ensures that the relationship is deeply structural, physically binding a neighboring island directly to a rival global power. So, the collision of those deep economic ties, that military cooperation, and that extremely close geography creates a pretty sobering reality. Cuba essentially acts as a geopolitical pawn.
The analysis hits the nail on the head here, noting, if tensions between the U.S. and Russia escalate further, Cuba could become a pawn in a larger geopolitical game. Think about how chess works. A pawn isn't moved for its own ambitions, right? It gets utilized by the player controlling the board to threaten the opponent's most valuable assets. If these larger players escalate their global tensions, Cuba is perfectly positioned to be used as massive leverage. It is exactly the 90-mile tripwire we talked about at the very beginning of this explainer.
Which really leaves us with this big, final thought. What actually happens if global powers push the geopolitical chessboard just a little too far? We've seen how a small island heavily supported by Russia serves as a direct mirror to other global alliances, and how its current status quo rests entirely on the absolute intolerance of a neighboring superpower. I'm going to leave you with that question to ponder because it perfectly highlights the immense fragility of these global alliances and the ever-present threat of broader conflict. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you on the next one.